Ideologies may have their distinct place of birth in the grand narrative of history, and at least for a time, tend to be rooted to their place of origin. But given sufficient passage of time, they inevitably evolve, diverge, and split, and do many other things that belief systems tend to do. Christianity, presumably, began in a tiny area of the Levant, but spread in time over an entire empire, and was de facto adopted as the religion of choice by the entirety of the European continent, with later fracturing and divisions brought about by the Reformation. Fast forward to today, and Christianity is found on every inhabited continent of the world. The ideas of communism may well have been first formulated by one Karl Marx, but they were adopted and molded by others decades and even well over a century later. Most modern economies are roughly what we might call capitalist, in that they follow the basics of so-called free market economies, but they nonetheless tend to differ from each other in their exact execution of capitalist principles, with historical, national, and cultural influences being the primary tool of interpretation in such matters. This tells us that ideas and ideologies do not remain static. Rather, they evolve over time, and more importantly, evolve in concert with the peoples and cultures that encounter them. Even something as standard as Catholicism is envisaged and practiced somewhat differently in a place such as South Korea than it is in Italy or Spain or Portugal, despite the relative uniformity of Catholic doctrine, simply by dint of contact with a different culture with a different historical background. The same could be said of the communism that exists in its current incarnation in China. It is a far cry from most attempts at formulating a system based on communism in the past, and this brings us to the matter at hand, namely the modern Chinese interpretation of the ideology we call feminism, that had been born in the West and evolved in the West, but has since expanded to most corners of the industrialized globe. Like any ideology, Chinese adopters of feminism have injected their own worldview into something originally alien to them. Now, modern feminism has, of course, undergone several iterations. We're currently likely on wave 4.5 or thereabouts. I lose track. But the general approach that Western feminism has taken has been one that has incorporated some of the stranger takes on the world, building largely upon social constructionist ideas and integrating these ideas into its narrative. From this, we receive the wisdom that men and women are not different in any really significant way than how they are raised and socialized, and that virtually every difference we do find can be plotted back to some social intervention that led to said difference. As such, modern Western feminism generally likes to ignore biology, when it is convenient to do so, at the very least. By these lights, neither biology nor evolution have had an impact on modern human beings, and women and men are what they are because someone, somewhere, at some point in time, told them to be these things or forced them to engage in certain activities that led them to their current state of existence. Now, it bears repeating that one of the reasons why some people have arrived at the social constructionist view is that technology and civilization that have emerged over the millennia help to create the setting in which one begins to be in a position to deny the influence of the very biology that has accompanied our species since it first stepped onto the scene. And that, at least, is in part modern civilization technology have aided in taming this biology, which is to say that prior to the emergence of modern technological comfort, likely no such school of thought existed, and it seems very unlikely it could have ever existed given the exigencies of the past. And so it was with the very first incarnation of feminism, and every subsequent recreation of it. Its presence requires a modern, safe, civilized world to exist as a prerequisite, as without it, biological reality would impose itself rather harshly on its detractors. And it should be pointed out relentlessly, as I have often done so in the past, that modernity has this tendency to obscure all manner of the more primal aspects of human nature, existence itself. It's not unique to feminism. It's just that some aspects of the modern mirage are somewhat less ideological and others are more so. Because the general premise of most forms of feminism in the West is that most relevant differences and outcomes in the observable world are due to social influences and interactions, people in the West who have been ideologically attached to it have tended to want to influence and drive social policy, partly due to sincere ideological conviction that the lives of women would be improved by aggressive social intervention, but also due to the desire for power and influence. That goes without saying. Think about, for example, the so-called Duluth model of domestic violence, largely founded by and pushed for by the late feminist Ellen Pence. It has formed the modern response model, the backbone of what's sometimes called the batterer intervention program. And the entire program has been based upon fantastical theories about patriarchal violence, with men as perpetrators and women as victims, with zero evidence other than feminist speculation and unproven claims. Yet, it is and remains the standard model by which most interactions and investigations with respect to domestic violence are carried out. Such a policy, along with the theories behind it, is typical insofar as the individual Ellen Pence who came up with it did not aggregate data, nor did she run tests to confirm its claims, nor did she study sociological phenomena more broadly. Same-sex female relationships, for example, report rates of abuse at twice the frequency of different-sex relationships. And in such cases, no patriarchy is involved, since men are curiously absent from the equation. And despite this, large-scale policy is and has been implemented across the board based on this uninformed speculation. And yet another example coming from Europe. Earlier this year, Germany's cabinet approved legislation to force larger listed companies to have at least one woman on their management boards, following years of debate over the issue. The law builds upon a 30% quota for supervisory boards introduced in 2015 and will apply to listed companies with more than 3 management board members. The new law affects around 70 companies, of which around 30 currently have no woman on their management boards at all. The German legislation also establishes stricter gender equality rules for government-controlled companies, where boards with more than 2 members will have to have at least 1 woman on them. And these are 2 examples of policies informed by feminism. And one of the obvious reasons why this has happened in the West has been the simple fact that countries like the United States and Germany are, for better or worse, elected democracies, theoretically at least, and theoretically non-autocratic. Citizenry and the interactions of citizenry with politicians can have effects on policy to varying degrees, and thus the combination of belief and social policy being the primary cause of differences between the sexes, as well as the accessibility of government, has allowed Western-style feminism to reach the dizzying heights it has reached, particularly in academia. But beyond this, Western governments are much more receptive to cultural trends and allow their policies to be influenced by them. And at the end of the day, politics is subordinate to culture. And as much as feminism in any form is political, it primarily is a cultural influence and phenomenon and has a way of finagling its way into the political arena. And the West is susceptible to this in a way that other cultures and forms of government are not. And with that, we come to the next point. When in the 1960s people were attempting to ram through all the glories of second-wave feminism in other parts of the world, very different things were afoot and were happening. To be specific, China was heading in a markedly different direction. In the last decade of his rule, Chairman Mao Zedong was concerned with the development failures of the Soviet Union, and fearing that a similar such fate might befall China, he set China on a different path. Mao had 4 primary objectives he sought to achieve within the context of the Cultural Revolution: to replace his former successors with leaders who were more in line with his way of thinking, to fix the Chinese Communist Party, to allow the Chinese youth to participate in a quote-unquote revolutionary experience, and to achieve specific policy changes so as to improve the overall education, healthcare, and cultural systems of China. This is important because many things happened during this revolutionary process. China's schools were shut down. All religions and worship of any kind were banned. Churches and temples were destroyed. And those who remained faithful were imprisoned. Much of what has been regarded as a loss of traditional values and modern China's disconnection to its past may be attributed to this period. In the wake of many reforms, the one-child policy was introduced in 1979 and ended in 2015, when the Chinese government raised the limit to 2. This had a massive impact on sex ratios in China. Remember that usually, as a result of natural trends, the ratio of males to females hovers around 50-50. And in 2020, the sex ratio of the total population in China was 105,302 males per 100 females. There were 738,247,340, or 738.25 million males, and 701,076,434, or 701.08 million females in China. The percentage of the female population was 48.71% compared to 51.29% male population. And subsequently, China's had 37,017 more males than females. China has the world's most skewed sex ratio at birth, with about 113 boys born for every 100 girls. This probably has a lot to do with the preference for male children stemming from the perception that males would be a better bet for providing for their parents later in life. These numbers might not seem like much, but the reality is that it is enough of a skew to have profound societal-wide effects. And it is into this morass that we encounter feminism in the Chinese context. A feminism, to be sure, influenced by the West, but one that is just as much influenced by China, its own cultural and historical legacy. In the context of Chinese feminism, there's emerged a term called uterine morality, and it goes something like this. What if there was a program allowing the government to go around collecting sperm from good-looking, smart, healthy men, celebrities, scientists, and athletes, and put it in a bank where any woman could access it? The bank would be state-run, held to tight scientific and ethical standards, and provide a wide range of benefits to its single clients, including daycare and healthcare. What would be finally enough to stabilize China's free-falling fertility rate? It may sound like the plot of some absurdist Brave New World knockoff, but in some corners of the Chinese internet, radical self-proclaimed feminists are serious about what they call zigong dao, uterine morality, and they're not willing to accept anything but the very best genetic material. The concept of uterine morality first surfaced back in 2013 when a Chinese feminist published the idea of how the human uterus was something akin to being holy in an evolutionary sense, taking inspiration from the basic reproductive biology of our species where sperm are cheap and eggs are expensive. From this simple rule of reproduction for humans, we can derive much of what we consider standard when it comes to dealing with males and females respectively. The women and children first credo, a prioritization of funding and support for female health issues in disproportionate measure compared to similar such male issues, and the general acquiescence of social policy to female preference. In short, women are, by their very nature, biologically more valuable than men are. Now, this might be no news to you, in fact, it shouldn't be, but the conventional narrative found in Western feminism does not acknowledge very much of anything of the biological differences or the biological realities that exist between men and women. Not so much with this strange form of Chinese feminism with its claims to uterine morality. In essence, for a woman to have good uterine morals, she must take responsibility for her future children and pick a good-looking, intelligent, strong, financially sound man with no family history of genetic disorders. To advocates, this is common sense, a form of genetic selection intended to ensure that future generations evolve into healthy, beautiful, and intelligent beings. Some frame it as protecting the so-called rights of the unborn child. Only women with a sense of uterine morality truly love their children, it is quoted. Wrote one blogger, they reject ugly, poor, sick, and abusive men, and they would never hurt their own descendants just to satisfy their sexual perversions. And so it goes. Advocates of this form of feminism are hyper-aware of the underlying biological reality with respect to men and women, and take it to what is to them its logical conclusion, namely the reproductive empowerment of women and a complete disregard for men's interests. This disregard for male interests, of course, is something that is shared by most forms of feminism, whether conventionally Western or otherwise. And of course, there are Chinese feminists who follow a more conventional bent when it comes to feminism. But the uterine version presented here coincides with some of the fundamental differences that exist between the Occident and the Orient. Whilst the West has both culturally and politically trodden the path of political correctness, and bristles at any thought of anything being independent of infinite social and cultural malleability, and enforces these beliefs with the fervor of a religious fanatic, China has gone down a very different path. The cultural and social reshuffling brought about by Mao's revolution, as well as the post-Mao enforced one-child policy, have led to startlingly different interpretations and conclusions about the world. Perhaps most relevant to this is the fact that the presence of 37.17 million more men than women in China affords women even more selection power than they otherwise would have. Since women, as a matter of course, do the selecting, the skewed ratio further empowers them, which coincides with the ideas promulgated by advocates of so-called uterine morality. But there's a further point. What the uterine moralists are arguing for is nothing fundamentally distinct from what women already tacitly and subconsciously do each time they partake in the reproductive dance. They're simply louder and more honest about it. What Mao's revolution and the subsequent changes wrought by the policies have done has been to create a world where niceties and illusions that are normally proffered in the West are largely absent in the Chinese context. There's no pretense, no doublespeak of any sort, and perhaps this aspect of Chinese culture is best represented in the infamous famous song, No Car, No House, where very bluntly we are told that a man with insufficient resources will simply be kicked to the curb. It is true that increasingly women in the West are becoming blunter as the social consequences of frankness increasingly wane, but in general, the West remains far more reserved and restrained in its expression of what is versus what ought to be. Cue the 300-pound woman looking great in that dress. And I would be remiss, of course, if I did not mention the fact that China is ruled by an autocratic government, at least theoretically, and it can do, theoretically, again, whatever it wants. A feminism that sought to change social policy with its founder before it even made the attempt in a place like China. As a consequence, the kinds of elaborate projects that feminists have embarked on in the West are far less likely, the kinds of things we can observe, for example, in the Duluth model. The sex ratio skewing is more relevant. Coupled by the Chinese disinclination to waffle about the biological underlying reality one inhabits, makes the uterine moralist position a much more understandable one, given the circumstance. More broadly, the primary differences between the Western current imperative and the Chinese imperative are well illustrated by the differences between a uterine moralist feminism and a classical Western feminism. China seeks to dominate the world and progress by means of a pragmatic realpolitik. The United States and company are running themselves, on the other hand, into the ground, following the scent of chimeras and cultural fictions that people seemingly invent on the fly. Very different indeed. And finally, lest we fall into our own ideological trap, we ought to always remind ourselves that ideology, although important and influential in informing many things, political and cultural, does not define the average person's behavior, whether male or female. The majority of people are animated by the immediate environment of their lives in conjunction with the particulars of their psychology and biology, and thus we should not lose sight of this if we want to understand the big human picture, feminism aside, as there are, of course, contributing ideological factors in women's behavior, but most of female behavior has nothing to do with ideology and can be reduced to them acting upon basic instincts in their environment without much, if any, ideological influence. For this reason, it is important to parse the differences between ideological influence and simple human behavior, something that oftentimes too many people fail to do. In doing so, we may at least provide as accurate a portrait of human motivation as possible without falling prey to overly simplistic explanations and our own potential delusions. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe if you've not yet done so. Please leave a like, share, and hit the bell icon. And as this channel operates off of the generosity and contributions of its subscribers, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Any and all support is more than appreciated. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.